to Fast Asleep with Gina Marie, where you can tuck in for another classic short story. Thank you for joining us. I'm Gina, and Marie is in Italy, Lake Como, Italy. I wonder if George Clooney will be there. Well, anyway, Bob is here. Thankfully, what would I do without Bob? I would just be a voice, nothing else. Thank you, Bob. Oh, and thank you, listeners, for your likes, your sweet comments. Oh, Evelyn, you are so very kind. Thank you. And for your subscriptions. Follow those. They're kind of fun. We have a great story for you today from an author who is known as America's master craftsman of the mystery short story. Oh, yes. Today's is very mysterious. If you don't know Stanley Ellin, it is now time to know him. Longtime listeners, I know you know about this fabulous author. So, anytime, guys, just scroll back for his most well-known short story, Specialty of the House. And what a specialty. And that's not the only Stanley Ellin you'll find on Fast Asleep. Check them all out. He wrote 15 novels and dozens of short stories, with 4 becoming major motion pictures and others television episodes. Critics found nothing but praise for Mr. Stanley Ellin. New York Times critics Anthony Boucher and Alan J. Hubin had lots of words for him, calling him the American master and coining that master craftsman phrase as well. And that had to be very, very satisfying for a boy raised in Brooklyn, New York, who often suffered from some awful ailment or another throughout his childhood. Stanley loved to read and was very bright. In fact, he graduated from Brooklyn College when he was just 19 years old. He married fellow student Jean Michael. And then his variety of jobs began. He was a magazine salesman, a boilermaker's assistant, a steel worker, a shipyard worker — I guess the ailments were gone by then — a dairy farmer, a junior college teacher, and of course, now it's 1944, he was a member of the U.S. Army. When he returned from World War II, he began his most important and most lucrative job, that of being a writer. His very first short story, the one I just mentioned, Specialty of the House, launched Stanley Ellin to well-known status, just like that. Yeah, he was very well recognized for his work, and also he is still the most nominated writer for the Edgar Allan Poe Award, and he's won that award on at least 3 occasions. He also has served as president of the Mystery Writers of America. He passed in 1986 from a heart attack. He was 69 years old. No one wrote psychological thrillers like this man. You're in for such a treat. And they often dealt with revenge, as does today's story. So, published in 1956. Tuck in, everybody. From Stanley Ellin. It's Broker's Special. It was the first time in a good many years that Cornelius, a Wall Street broker, had made the homeward trip in any train other than the broker's special. The special was his kind of train. The passengers on it were his kind of people. Executives, professionals, men of substance and dignity who could recognize each other without introductions and understand each other without words. If it weren't for the senator's dinner party, Cornelius reflected. But the senator had insisted, so there was no escape from that abomination of abominations, the midweek dinner party. And, of course, no escape from the necessity of taking an earlier train home, to the tedium of dressing, and an evening of too much food, too much liquor, and all the resultant misery the next morning. Filled with this depressing thought, Cornelius stepped down heavily from the train to the familiar platform and walked over to his car. Since Claire preferred the station wagon, he used the sedan to get to and from the station. When they were first married 2 years ago, she had wanted to chauffeur him back and forth, but the idea had somehow repelled him. He had always felt there was something vaguely obscene about the way other men publicly kissed their wives goodbye in front of the station every morning, and the thought of being placed in their position filled him with a chilling embarrassment. He had not told this to Claire, however. He had simply told her he had not married her to obtain a housekeeper or chauffeur. She was to enjoy her life, not fill it with unnecessary duties. Ordinarily it was no more than a 15-minute drive through the countryside to the house. But now, in keeping with the already exasperating tenor of the day's events, he met an unexpected delay. A mile or so past where the road branched off from the highway, it crossed the main line of the railroad. There was no guard or crossing gate here, but a red light and a bell, which was ringing an insistent warning as Cornelius drove up. He braked the car and sat tapping his fingers restlessly on the steering wheel while the endless clanking length of a freight went by. And then, before he could start the car again, he saw them. It was Claire and a man, his wife, and some man in the station wagon, roaring past him into town. And the man was driving, seated big and blond and arrogant behind the wheel like a Viking, with one arm around Claire, who, with eyes closed, rested her head on his shoulder. There was a look on her face, too, such as Cornelius had never seen there before, but which he had sometimes dreamed of seeing. Well, they passed by in a flash, but the picture they made was burned as brilliant in his mind as a photograph on film. He would not believe it, he told himself incredulously. He refused to believe it, but the picture was there, before him, growing clearer each second, becoming more and more terribly alive as he watched it. The man's arm possessing her, her look of acceptance, of sensual acceptance. He was shaking uncontrollably now, the blood pounding in his head as he prepared to turn the car and follow them. Then he felt himself go limp. Follow them? Where? Back to town, undoubtedly, where the man would be waiting for the next train to the city. And then what? A denunciation in the grand style, a scene, a public humiliation for himself as much as for them? Oh, he could stand anything, but not such humiliation. It had been bad enough when he had first married Claire and realized his friends were laughing at him for it. A man in his position to marry his secretary, and a girl half his age at that. Now he knew what they had been laughing at. But he had been blind then. There had been such an air of cool formality about her when she carried on her duties in the office. She sat with such prim dignity when she took his notes. She had dressed so modestly, and when he had first invited her to dinner, she had reddened with the flustered naivete of a young girl being invited on her first date. Naivete. And all the time, he thought, furiously, she must have been laughing at me. She, along with the rest of them. He drove to the house, slowly, almost blindly. The house was empty. He realized that, of course, it was Thursday, the servants' day off, which made it the perfect day for Claire's purpose. He went directly to the library, sat down at the desk there, and unlocked the top drawer. His gun was in that drawer, a short-barreled .38, and he picked it up slowly, hefting its cold weight in his hand, savoring the sense of power it gave him. And then, abruptly, his mind went back to something Judge Hilliker had once told him, something strangely interesting that the old man had said while sharing a seat with him on the broker's special. Guns? Hilliker had said. Knives? Blunt instruments? You can throw them all out the window. As far as I'm concerned, there is just one perfect weapon. An automobile. Any automobile in good working order. And why? Because when an automobile is going fast enough, it will kill anyone it hits. And if the driver gets out and looks sorry, he'll find that he's the one getting everybody's sympathy and not that bothersome corpse on the ground who shouldn't have been in the way anyhow. As long as the driver isn't drunk or flagrantly reckless, he can kill anybody in this country he wants to and suffer no more than a momentary embarrassment and a penalty that isn't even worth worrying about. Think it over, man, the judge continued. To most people, the automobile, some sort of god. And if God happens to strike you down, it's your hard luck. As for me, when I cross a street, I just say a little prayer. There was more of that in Judge Hilliker's mordant and long-winded style, but Cornelius had no need to remember it. What he needed, he now had, and very carefully he put the gun back in the drawer, slid the drawer shut, and locked it. Claire came in while he still sat brooding at the desk, and he forced himself to regard her with cold objectivity, this radiantly lovely woman who was playing him for a fool, and who now stood wide-eyed in the doorway with an incongruously large bag of groceries clutched to her. "I saw the car in the garage," she said breathlessly. "I was afraid something was wrong, that you weren't feeling well." "I feel very well." "Oh, but you're home so early. You never come home this early." "I've always managed to refuse invitations to midweek dinner parties before." "Oh, Lord," she gasped. "The dinner! It never even entered my mind. I've been so busy all day." "Yes," he said. "Doing what?" "Well, everyone's off today, so I took care of the house from top to bottom, and then, when I looked in the pantry and saw we needed some things, I ran into town for them." She gestured at the bulky paper bag with her chin. "Now, I'll have your bath ready and your things laid out as soon as I put this stuff away." Watching her leave, he felt an honest admiration for her. Another woman would have invented a visit to a friend who might, at some later time, accidentally let the cat out of the bag. Or another woman would not have thought to burden herself with a useless package to justify a trip into town. But not Claire, who was evidently as clever as she was beautiful. And she was damnably attractive. His male friends may have laughed behind his back, but in their homes, she was always eagerly surrounded by them. When he entered a room full of strangers with her, he saw how all men's eyes followed her with a frankly covetous interest. No, nothing must happen to her. Nothing at all. It was the man who had to be destroyed, just as one would destroy any poacher on his preserves, any lunatic with an axe in hand running amok through his home. No. Claire would have to be hurt a little, would have to be taught her lesson, but that would be done most effectively through what happened to the man. Stay with me. Claire would have to be hurt a little, would have to be taught her lesson, but that would be done most effectively through what happened to the man. Cornelius learned very quickly that his plans would have to take in a good deal more than the simple act of waylaying the man and running him down. There were details, innumerable details, covering every step of the way before and after the event, which had to be jigsawed into place bit by bit in order to make it perfect. In that respect, Cornelius thought gratefully, the judge had been far more helpful than he had realized in his irony. Murder by automobile was the perfect murder because with certain details taken care of, it was not even murder at all. There was the victim, and there was the murderer standing over him, and the whole thing would be treated with perfunctory indifference. After all, what was one more victim among the 30,000 each year? He was a statistic, to be regarded with some tongue-clicking and a shrug of helplessness. Not by Claire, of course. Coincidence can be stretched far, but hardly far enough to cover the case of a husband's running down his wife's lover. And that was the best part of it. Claire would know, but would be helpless to say anything, since saying anything must expose her own wrongdoing. She would spend her life, day after day, knowing that she had been found out, knowing that a just vengeance had been exacted, and standing forewarned against any other such temptations that might come her way. But what of the remote possibility that she might choose to speak out and expose herself? There, Cornelius reflected, fitting another little piece of the jigsaw into place. Coincidence would instantly go to work for him. If there was no single shred of evidence that he had ever suspected her affair, or that he had ever seen the man before, the accident must be regarded by the law as coincidence. Either way, his position was unassailable. It was with this in mind that he patiently and single-mindedly went to work on his plans. He was tempted at the start to call in some professional investigator who could promptly and efficiently bring him the information he wanted, but after careful consideration, he put this idea aside. A smart investigator might easily put two and two together after the accident. If he were honest, he might go to the authorities with his suspicions. If he were dishonest, he might be tempted to try blackmail. Obviously, there was no way of calling in an outsider without risking one danger or the other, and nothing at all was going to be risked here. So, it took Cornelius several precious weeks to glean the information he wanted, and as he admitted to himself, it might have taken even longer had not Claire and the man maintained such an unfailing routine. Thursday was the one day of the week on which the man would pay his visits. And then, a little before the city-bound train arrived at the station, Claire would drive the station wagon into an almost deserted side street, a block from the plaza. In the car, the couple would kiss with an intensity that made Cornelius's flesh crawl. As soon as the man left the car, Claire would drive swiftly away, and the man would walk briskly to the plaza, make his way through the cars parked at the curb there, cross the plaza, obviously sunk in his own thoughts and with only half an eye for passing traffic, and would enter the station. Well, the third time Cornelius witnessed this performance, he could have predicted the man's every step with deadly accuracy. Occasionally during this period, Claire mentioned that she was going to the city to do some shopping, and Cornelius took advantage of this as well. He was standing in a shadow of the terminal's waiting room when her train pulled in. He followed her at a safe distance to the street. His cab trailed hers almost to the door of the shabby apartment house where the man lived. The man was sitting on the grimy steps of the house, obviously waiting for her. When he led her into the house, as Cornelius bitterly observed, they held hands like a pair of school children. Oh, and then there was a long wait, a wait which took up most of the afternoon. But Cornelius gave up waiting before Claire reappeared. The eruption of fury he knew after that scene gave him the idea of staging the accident there on the city streets the next day. But Cornelius quickly dismissed the thought. It would mean driving the car into the city, which was something he never did, and that would be a dangerous deviation from his own routine. Besides, city tabloids, unlike his staid local newspaper, sometimes publicized automobile accidents not only by printing the news of them, but also by displaying pictures of the victim and culprit on their pages. Oh, he wanted none of that. This was a private affair, strictly private. No, there was no question that the only place to settle matters was right in the plaza itself. And the more Cornelius reviewed his plans in preparation for the act, the more he marveled at how flawless they were. Nothing could conceivably go wrong. If by some mischance he struck down the man without killing him, his victim would be in the same position as Claire, unable to speak openly without exposing himself. If he missed the man entirely, he was hardly in the dangerous position of an assassin who misses his victim and is caught with a gun or knife in his hand. An automobile wasn't a weapon. The affair would simply be another close call for a careless pedestrian. However, he wanted no close calls, and to that end, he took to parking the car somewhat farther from the station than he ordinarily did. The extra distance, he estimated, would allow him to swing the car across the plaza in an arc which would meet the man as he emerged from between the parked cars across the street. That would just about make explanations uncalled for. A man stepping out from between parked cars would be more in violation of the law than the driver who struck him. Not only did he make sure to set the car at a proper distance from the station entrance, but Cornelius also took to backing it into place, as some other drivers did. Oh, now the front wheels were facing the plaza, and he could quickly get up all the speed he wanted. And more than that, he would be facing the man from the instant he came into sight. The day before the one he had chosen for the final act, Cornelius waited until he was clear of traffic on his homeward drive, and then stopped the car on a deserted part of the road, letting the motor idle. Then he carefully gauged the distance to a tree, some 30 yards ahead. This, he estimated, would be the distance across the plaza. He started the car and then drove it as fast as he could past the tree, with the big machine snarling as it picked up speed. Once past the tree, he braced himself, stepped hard on the brake, and felt the pressure of the steering wheel against his chest as the car slewed to a shrieking stop. That was it. That was all there was to it. He left the office the next day, at the exact minute he had set for himself. After his secretary had helped him on with his coat, he turned to her as he had prepared himself to do and made a wry face. Just not feeling right, he said. I don't know what's wrong with me, Miss Wynant. And as he knew good secretaries were trained to do, she frowned worriedly at him and said, Well, if you didn't work so hard, Mr. Bollinger. He waved that aside brusquely. Oh, nothing that getting home early to a good rest won't cure. Oh, he slapped at the pockets of his coat. My pills, Miss Wynant, they're in the top drawer over there. They were only a few aspirins in an envelope, but it was the impression that counted. A man who was not feeling well had that much more justification for a mishap while he was driving. The early train was familiar to him now. He had ridden on it several times during the past few weeks, but always circumspectly hidden behind a newspaper. Now it was to be different. When the conductor came through to check his computation ticket, Cornelius was sitting limp in his seat, clearly a man in distress. Conductor, he asked, if you don't mind, could you get me some water? The conductor glanced at him and hastily departed. When he returned with a dripping cup of water, Cornelius slowly and carefully removed an aspirin from the envelope and washed it down gratefully.
Yeah, now if there's anything else,
the conductor said,
you just let me know.
No, Cornelius said. No, I'm a little under the weather, that's all. But at the station, the conductor was there to lend him a solicitous hand down and dally briefly.
You're not a regular, are you?
The conductor said.
At least not on this train.
Cornelius felt a lift of gratification. "No," he said. "I've only taken this train once before. I usually travel on the broker's special."
Oh,
The conductor looked him up and down and grinned.
well, that figures,
He said,
"Hope you found our service as good as the specials."
In the small station, Cornelius sat down on a bench, his head resting against the back of the bench, his eyes on the clock over the ticket agent's window. Once or twice he saw the agent glance worriedly through the window at him, and that was fine. What was not so fine was the rising feeling in him, a lurching nervousness in his stomach, a too heavy thudding of his heart in his chest. He had allowed himself 10 minutes here. Each minute found the feeling getting more and more oppressive. It was an effort to contain himself, to prevent himself from getting to his feet and rushing out to the car before the minute hand of the clock had touched the small black spot that was his signal. Then, on the second, he got up, surprised at the effort it required to do this, and slowly walked out of the station, the agent's eyes following him all the way, and down past the station to the car. He climbed behind the wheel, closed the door firmly after him, and started the motor. The soft purring of the motor under his feet sent a new strength up through him. He sat there, soaking it up, his eyes fixed on the distance across the plaza. When the man first appeared, moving with rapid strides toward him, it struck Cornelius in some strange way that the tall blonde figure was like a puppet being drawn by an invisible wire to his destined place on the stage. And then, as he came closer, it was plain to see that he was smiling broadly, singing aloud in his exuberance of youth and strength and triumph. That was the key, which unlocked all paralysis, which sent the motor roaring into furious life. For all the times he had lived the scene in his mind's eye, Cornelius was unprepared for the speed with which it happened. There was the man, stepping out from between the cars, still blind to everything. There was Cornelius's hand on the horn, the ultimate inspiration. A warning that could not possibly be heeded, and more than anything else, an insurance of success. The man swung toward the noise, his face all horror, his hands out-thrust as if to fend off what was happening. There was the high-pitched scream, abruptly cut off by the shock of impact, more violent than Cornelius had ever dreamed. And then everything dissolving into the screech of brakes. The plaza had been deserted before it had happened. Now, people were running from all directions, and Cornelius had to push his way through them to catch a glimpse of the body.
Better not look,
someone warned, but he did look and saw the crumpled form. The legs scissored into an unnatural position, the face graying. As he watched, he swayed, and a dozen helping hands reached out to support him. But it was not weakness which affected him now, but an overwhelming, giddy sense of victory. A sense of victory heightened by the voices around him.
Walked right into it with his eyes wide open.
I could hear that horn a block away.
Drunk, maybe. The way he stood right there.
The only danger now lay in overplaying his hand. He had to watch out for that. Had to keep fitting piece after piece of the plan together, and then there would be no danger. He sat in the car while a policeman questioned him with official gravity, and he knew from the growing sympathy in the policeman's voice that he was making the right impression. No, he was free to go home if he wished. Charges, of course, had to be automatically preferred against him, but the way things looked... Yes, they would be glad to phone Mrs. Bollinger, and they could drive him home, but if he preferred to have her do it... He had allowed time enough for her to be at home when the call was made, and he spent the next 15 minutes with the crowd staring at him through the car window with a morbid and sympathetic curiosity. When the station wagon drew up nearby, Elaine magically appeared through the crowd. When Claire was at his side, the lane disappeared. Even frightened and bewildered, she was a beautiful woman, Cornelius thought. And he had to admit to himself she knew how to put on a sterling show of wifely concern and devotion, false as it was. But perhaps that was because she didn't know yet, and it was time for her to know. He waited until she had helped him into the station wagon, and when she sat down in the driver's seat, he put an arm tight around her. "Oh, by the way, officer," he asked with grave anxiety through the open window, "did you find out who the man was? Did he have any identification on him?" The policeman nodded.
"Young fellow from the city," he said. "So, we'll have to check up on him there. Name of Lundgren, Robert Lundgren, if his card means anything." Against his arm, Cornelius felt, rather than heard, the choked gasp, felt the uncontrollable small shivering. Her face was as gray as that of the man's out there in the street. "All right, Claire," he said softly. "Let's go home." She drove by instinct out through the streets of the town. Her face was vacuous, her eyes set and staring. He was almost grateful when they reached the highway and she finally spoke in a quiet and wondering voice. "You knew," she said. You knew about it and you killed him for it.
Yes, Cornelius said. I knew about it.
Then you're crazy, she said, dispassionately, her eyes still fixed ahead of her. You must be crazy to kill someone like that. Her even, informative tone fired his anger as much as what she was saying.
It was justice, he said between his teeth. It was coming to him. She was still remote.
You don't understand.
Don't understand what?
She turned toward him, and he saw that her eyes were glistening wet. I knew him before I ever knew you, before I ever started working in the office. We always went together. It didn't seem as if there was any point living if we couldn't be together. She paused, only a fraction of a second. But things didn't go right. He had big ideas that didn't make any money, and I couldn't stand that. I was born poor, and I couldn't stand marrying poor and dying poor. That's why I married you. And I tried to be a good wife. You'll never know how hard I tried, but that wasn't what you wanted. You wanted a showpiece, not a wife. Something to parade around in front of people so that they could admire you for owning it, just like they admire you for everything else you own.
You are talking like a fool, he said harshly. And watch the road. We turn off here.
Listen to me, she said. I was going to tell you all about it. I was going to ask for a divorce, not a penny to go with it or anything like that, just the divorce, so that I could marry him and make up for all the time I had thrown away. And that's what I told him today. And if you had only asked, only talked to me.
She would get over it, he thought. It had been even more serious than he had realized, but as the saying went, all passes. She had nothing to trade her marriage for any longer. When she understood that clearly, they would make a new start. Oh, it was a miracle that he had thought of using the weapon he had, and that he had used it so effectively. A perfect weapon, the judge had said. He'd never know how perfect. It was the warning clangor of the bell at the grade crossing that jarred Cornelius from his reverie, that and the alarming realization that the car's speed was not slackening at all. Then everything else was submerged by the angry bawling of a diesel horn. And when he looked up incredulously, it was to the raging mountain of steel that was the broker's special, hurling itself over the crossing, directly ahead.
Watch out!
He cried wildly.
My God, what are you doing?
In that last split second, when her foot went down hard on the accelerator, he knew. Introduction information for this episode is from The Unconventional Private Eyes of Stanley Ellin by J. Kingston Pierce for Crime Reads, and other information in our show notes. Music today is Etude by Joop Beving. Emotional and inspiring piano by Morning Light Music. Infra 4 by Max Richter. And The Last Walk by Karen Beale. If you would like to contact me, please do. Right here in comments or at fastasleepwithginamarie44@gmail.com or on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Please keep us right here for you with your reviews, your likes, your comments, and those subscriptions. Thank you for listening. Keyword: automobile. Until next time, good night.